2,500 farmers with spears facing 12,000 professional English soldiers, a wooden bridge barely wide enough for 3 horses. The finest heavy cavalry in Europe about to walk into a trap that will turn a river red with blood. This is Stirling Bridge. And this is how Scotland destroyed an empire's army with nothing but tactical genius and rage. September 11th, 1297. To understand how this impossible victory happened, you need to understand the man whose shadow hung over Scotland like a storm cloud, King Edward I of England. They called him the Hammer of the Scots, and he'd earned that name in blood. Edward wasn't just a king, he was a conqueror with the strategic mind of Caesar and the ruthless efficiency of a war machine. In 1296, when the Scottish throne fell into dispute, Edward saw his opportunity. He declared himself Lord Paramount of Scotland, the supreme overlord who could choose Scotland's king like a man arranging chess pieces. But political control wasn't enough. He wanted total domination. Edward marched north with an army that rolled over Scottish resistance like an iron wave. Castles fell, armies scattered. The Scottish nobility, faced with the choice between death and submission, knelt one by one. They signed a document of surrender listing over 2,000 Scottish nobles pledging loyalty to the English crown. It was a national humiliation written in ink and sealed with fear. To make his conquest complete, Edward committed an act of symbolic violence that cut deeper than any sword. He took the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone where Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, and hauled it to Westminster Abbey as a trophy. Scotland, as a nation, was being erased. Edward left English garrisons in Scottish castles, English administrators in Scottish towns, and English soldiers patrolling Scottish roads. To fund this occupation, he appointed a man named Cressingham as treasurer. Cressingham was corrupt, greedy, and ruthless. He taxed the people until they bled, lining his own pockets while Scottish families starved. The Scots despised him with a hatred that burned like acid. By the summer of 1297, Scotland seemed finished. The occupation was complete. Resistance appeared futile. The nation that had stood proud and independent for centuries was now just another piece of Edward's empire. But the Hammer of the Scots had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated 2 men who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They came from different worlds, but desperation made them brothers, William Wallace and Andrew de Moray. Together, they would build an army from rage and lead it to the most stunning tactical victory of the medieval era. Wallace was not the simple peasant of legend. He was a minor landowner, educated enough to understand politics, but not powerful enough to influence it. He existed in that dangerous middle ground between nobility and common folk. What made Wallace extraordinary wasn't his birth, it was his absolute refusal to kneel. The truth about Wallace's early life is tangled in legend. Stories say English soldiers murdered his family, his father, perhaps his wife. The details blur across centuries, but the core truth remains. Something happened that transformed Wallace from a minor knight into an outlaw with nothing to lose and everything to avenge. By 1297, Wallace was already a ghost haunting the occupation, burning tax collectors' homes, ambushing patrols, leading guerrilla raids against English garrisons. The English dismissed him as a bandit, a common criminal playing at war. But the common people of Scotland saw something different. They saw a man who refused to submit when everyone else had surrendered. Wallace stood 6 feet 7 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. He was a giant who moved with surprising speed and fought with terrifying effectiveness. More importantly, he had charisma that couldn't be taught or faked. When Wallace spoke, men listened. When he called for resistance, they answered. But charisma alone couldn't defeat England's war machine. Wallace needed legitimacy, military training, and the resources that only nobility could provide. He needed Andrew de Moray. If Wallace has been remembered as Scotland's hero, Moray has been tragically forgotten. He was actual nobility, heir to a powerful family in northern Scotland. When Edward invaded, Moray had been captured and thrown into an English prison. But he escaped and returned to his lands with vengeance burning in his heart. While Wallace operated in the south, Moray was waging his own successful rebellion in the north, capturing castles and defeating English forces with the skill of a trained military commander. Moray had what Wallace lacked: noble blood that could legitimize a rebellion, military education in tactics and siege warfare, connections to other noble families who might join the fight. Wallace had what Moray needed: the common people's devotion, the guerrilla fighter's instincts, and a tactical brilliance that formal training couldn't teach. When these two men united their forces in the late summer of 1297, they created something unprecedented: an army that bridged Scotland's divided society. Moray brought lesser nobility, trained soldiers, and military discipline. Wallace brought farmers with scythes, burgesses from towns, escaped prisoners, and a burning desire for freedom that no amount of training could match. Together, they commanded roughly 2,500 men. It wasn't a professional standing army like England's forces. It was a coalition held together by rage, desperation, and the magnetic leadership of two men who refused to submit. They armed their forces with 12-foot pikes, long spears that could be massed in tight formations called skiltrons. Simple weapons, but in the right hands and the right terrain, they would prove devastatingly effective. The English thought they were dealing with bandits playing at rebellion. What they didn't understand was that Wallace and Moray were brilliant tactical commanders who had been studying English weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment was coming. The Earl of Surrey was marching north with 12,000 men to crush this rebellion once and for all. Surrey thought it would be a slaughter. He was right about that. He was just wrong about who would be slaughtered. Wallace and Moray watched the English army approach, and they smiled, because they had already chosen the battlefield, and on that battlefield there was a bridge. The English army arrived at Stirling expecting another easy victory. What they found was a narrow bridge, a rebel army on high ground, and two commanders who understood something Surrey did not. Sometimes the battlefield chooses the victor before the first sword is drawn. Stirling was no accident. Wallace and Moray had chosen this ground with the precision of master chess players. The town sat at a critical strategic point where the River Forth could be crossed. Control Stirling, and you controlled movement between northern and southern Scotland. But it wasn't the town that interested the two Scottish commanders. It was the bridge. The bridge at Stirling was ancient, wooden, and fatally narrow. Only 2 or 3 mounted knights could cross side by side. It stretched across the River Forth, which ran deep and fast enough to drown a man in full armor. On the north side of the bridge, the ground was marshy and soft, terrible terrain for heavy cavalry that relied on speed and impact. A natural killing ground if you knew how to use it, and Wallace and Moray knew exactly how to use it. They positioned their forces on Abbey Craig, a steep hill overlooking the bridge with a perfect commanding view. From that height, they could see everything. Every English soldier crossing, every banner, every movement, every mistake. The geography was their weapon. The English would have to cross that narrow bridge, funnel their massive army through a bottleneck just a few feet wide, and emerge onto marshy ground where their cavalry advantage would evaporate like morning mist. It was a masterpiece of tactical positioning, and the English were about to walk straight into it. The English commander, the Earl of Surrey, should have seen the trap. He was an elderly nobleman, a veteran of Edward's wars, but age had brought him arrogance instead of wisdom. Surrey looked at the rebel army and saw peasants with pointed sticks. He looked at his own forces and saw 12,000 professional soldiers, including the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The conclusion seemed obvious. This would be a massacre. He was right about that. He was just wrong about who would be massacred. Surrey's second-in-command was Cressingham, the hated treasurer. He was enormously fat, stupendously greedy, and dangerously impatient. He had been funding this campaign from his own embezzled fortune and wanted it finished quickly before it cost him more money. When scouts suggested taking a ford 2 miles upriver, where the army could cross safely and attack from better ground, Cressingham dismissed the idea. It would take too long. It would cost too much. The rebels were just bandits. Why waste time on tactical precautions? Even some of the Scottish nobles fighting for England saw the danger. They examined the bridge and the rebel positions and understood immediately what Wallace and Moray had created. They begged Surrey not to cross. "It's a trap," they warned. "We'll be slaughtered like cattle." Surrey ignored them. So did Cressingham. They were English. These were Scottish rebels. How dare anyone suggest the outcome was in doubt? Surrey's arrogance was about to kill 5,000 of his men. On the morning of September 11th, Surrey woke late, comfortable in his command tent. He ordered his forces to begin crossing the bridge. The Scottish army watched in silence from their high ground as English soldiers began filing across the narrow wooden structure, 2 or 3 at a time, a great army reduced to a thin trickle by the constraints of geography. Then Surrey did something that revealed his complete contempt for the enemy. He changed his mind. He recalled the troops for breakfast. The entire vanguard had to turn around, march back across the cramped bridge, and wait while their commander ate his morning meal. It was a gift to the defenders. It showed English contempt, English disorganization, and English arrogance all wrapped into one absurd decision. Wallace and Moray watched this comedy of errors and knew with absolute certainty that these men had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. After breakfast, Surrey ordered the crossing to resume. This time, he was committed. The English army began filing across the bridge in earnest. Knights in full armor, mounted on massive war horses, infantry in formation, supply wagons, an entire army squeezing through a bottleneck barely wider than a country road. It took time, hours. The wooden bridge creaked and swayed under the weight of armored men and horses. The River Forth rushed underneath, deep and cold and patient, waiting. If you're enjoying this story of tactical brilliance and impossible victories, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more incredible moments from history. And drop a comment below telling us which underdog battle you'd like to hear about next. Your suggestions help us choose what stories to tell. Wallace and Moray waited on Abbey Craig, watching like hawks circling prey. They had agreed on the signal. Let half the English army cross, exactly half. Enough to make the battle even, few enough to make them trapped. It required discipline. It required iron control over soldiers burning for revenge who could see their enemy pouring across the bridge below them. But these men trusted their commanders with a faith that bordered on religious devotion, so they waited, muscles tense, weapons ready, watching the trap slowly close. The English forces spread out on the marshy ground north of the bridge, trying to form battle lines in the soft earth. Their horses sank slightly with each step. More soldiers kept coming across the bridge, a steady stream of armor and steel. The army was splitting itself in two, separated by the narrow wooden bridge and the deep river. Surrey watched from the south bank, confident in his numerical superiority, already imagining his victory. He couldn't see what the Scots could see from their elevated position. He couldn't see the trap closing around half his army like iron jaws. Wallace raised his hand, the signal his men had been waiting for. Approximately 5,000 English soldiers had crossed. 5,000 more waited on the south bank. The English army was cut perfectly in half, divided by geography and their own arrogance. Wallace dropped his hand. The signal was given. 2,500 Scots charged down from Abbey Craig like a landslide of spears and rage, and the Battle of Stirling Bridge exploded into violence that would echo through history. The Scottish forces descended the hill in a controlled rush, pike formations tight and disciplined despite their peasant origins. They hit the English with 2 devastating strikes simultaneously, executed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. One force slammed into the troops who had crossed, driving them back against the marshy ground and the river. The second force seized both ends of the bridge itself, cutting it off like a tourniquet on a limb. In seconds, the situation transformed. The English army that had seemed so overwhelming moments before was now split into 2 helpless halves. Those who had crossed couldn't retreat back across the bridge. Those who hadn't crossed couldn't help their comrades dying on the far bank. The trap was sprung, and it was perfect. The ground turned into chaos and carnage. English cavalry tried to charge on the marshy terrain and found their horses sinking, struggling, vulnerable. The pride of England's military, its armored knights on massive war horses that could shatter shield walls on firm ground, were reduced to slow-moving targets floundering in mud. Wallace's pike formation surrounded them with practiced efficiency, 12-foot spears stabbing upward, impaling horses and dragging knights from their saddles. Once an armored knight was on the ground in that marshy hell, he was finished. The armor that protected him in normal combat became his coffin in the mud, too heavy to stand, too restrictive to fight effectively. Cressingham led the English forces that had crossed, desperately trying to organize a defense against the Scottish onslaught. He was a bureaucrat playing at being a warrior, and the battlefield punished him for his arrogance with brutal finality. The Scottish fighters recognized him immediately, the hated treasurer, the man who had taxed them into starvation while growing fat on their suffering. They converged on him like wolves on wounded prey, and Cressingham fell, cut down in the brutal fighting. His death was met with savage cheers. Wallace allegedly had Cressingham's corpse flayed and his skin made into a sword belt, a story that, true or not, revealed the depth of Scottish hatred for England's occupation. The pike formations were devastatingly effective, turning English advantages into fatal weaknesses. The Scots fought with a fury that came from years of oppression, and they fought with the confidence of men who knew the ground beneath their feet. Every advantage belonged to them: the terrain, the position, the tactical setup, the morale. The English forces trapped on the north bank were being systematically destroyed, surrounded and cut down with nowhere to run except into the river. And many tried exactly that. Armored knights, seeing their situation was hopeless, tried to escape by riding into the River Forth. It was a fatal choice born of desperation. The water was deep and the current was strong. Men in full plate armor sank like stones, drowning in sight of their comrades who could do nothing to help. Others tried to swim and were pulled under by the weight of their own protection, their arms flailing uselessly as steel dragged them down. The river that had seemed like a minor obstacle that morning had become a mass grave, claiming victims with patient, cold efficiency. On the south bank, Surrey watched the slaughter with growing horror. Half his army was being annihilated before his eyes, and there was absolutely nothing he could do. The bridge was too narrow to send reinforcements quickly enough. The few troops who did try to cross were met by Scottish defenders who had turned the bridge itself into a killing ground, a narrow corridor of death where English soldiers were cut down as fast as they attempted the crossing. Some accounts say the bridge collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers. Others suggest the Scots deliberately destroyed it to prevent English retreat or reinforcement. Either way, the result was the same. The bridge became impassable, and the trap was complete. 5,000 English soldiers were isolated, surrounded, and dying. The battle lasted only a few hours, but those hours were pure carnage that would be remembered for centuries. The Scottish forces methodically destroyed the English troops caught on the wrong side of the river, showing no mercy to an occupation force that had shown them none. Roughly 5,000 English soldiers died that day. 5,000 of England's finest troops, cut down by an army they had dismissed as peasants and bandits. The English casualties included knights, professional soldiers, and one hated treasurer whose death the Scots would celebrate for generations. Scottish losses were minimal. Modern historians estimate fewer than 100 casualties, though exact numbers are lost to time. It wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a perfectly executed tactical trap that turned numerical superiority into a fatal weakness, that used geography as a weapon more deadly than any sword. Wallace and Moray had done what Edward I thought impossible. They had destroyed an English army without even needing superior numbers or equipment, just superior intelligence, courage, and understanding of terrain. The Earl of Surrey, watching his forces disintegrate, made the decision that would define his legacy and shame his name. He fled. He abandoned his army, turned his horse south, and rode for his life without looking back. Legend says he didn't stop until he reached Berwick, over 100 miles away, his horse half dead from the desperate flight. The commander, who had dismissed Scottish rebels as beneath his concern, now ran from them in abject terror. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The bridge stood silent except for the rush of the river. Scotland had won a victory that no one, least of all Edward I, had thought possible. But the cost of that victory was only beginning to reveal itself. The battlefield fell quiet. The River Forth washed away the blood, and the bodies began to rot in the late summer heat. England had lost an army. Scotland had gained something far more precious and far more dangerous: hope. News of the victory spread across Scotland like wildfire in dry grass. In towns and villages, People who had lived under occupation for a year suddenly dared to imagine freedom. The English weren't invincible. The hammer of the Scots could be defied. Stirling Bridge proved that tactical brilliance could overcome overwhelming force, that choosing your battlefield mattered more than the size of your army. For the first time since Edward's conquest, Scotland could breathe. Wallace and Moray were named Guardians of Scotland, joint commanders of the realm in the absence of a king. It was the highest honor Scotland could bestow, and they had earned it in blood and fire. Wallace, the outlaw who had been dismissed as a bandit, was now a national hero, but the victory had a price that became clear in the weeks following the battle. Andrew de Moray, the forgotten hero, had been wounded during the fighting. By November of 1297, just 2 months after the triumph at Stirling Bridge, Moray was dead. History would remember William Wallace through statues, poems, and films. But Moray, the nobleman who provided legitimacy and military expertise, would fade into obscurity. 2 men won at Stirling Bridge. Only one would be remembered. Wallace continued the fight, leading raids deep into northern England with the same fury that Scotland had suffered. But Edward returned to Scotland in person in 1298. At Falkirk, Wallace faced Edward's army on open ground without the tactical advantages that had saved him at Stirling Bridge, and he was defeated. Years later, Wallace was captured, tried for treason, and executed with brutal finality. But Edward didn't understand that you can kill a man without killing what he represents. Stirling Bridge had proved that Scotland could fight and win. That lesson survived Wallace's death and inspired Robert the Bruce, who would use similar tactics to win Scottish independence at Bannockburn 17 years later. The seeds planted at Stirling Bridge had finally grown into freedom. Hit that share button and spread the word about these incredible moments in history. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you never miss when we post our next historical deep dive. Today, the Wallace Monument stands on Abbey Craig, overlooking the spot where 2,500 Scots refused to kneel. The original bridge is gone, replaced by stone. But tourists still visit and stand where Wallace stood, looking down at the river, trying to imagine the morning when everything changed. Stirling Bridge reminds us that battles aren't always won by the largest armies or the most advanced weapons. Sometimes they're won by leaders who understand their terrain, soldiers who fight for something bigger than themselves, and the willingness to take a calculated risk when the odds seem impossible. This is the story of Stirling Bridge, where 2,500 men with pikes and courage faced 12,000 soldiers with armor and arrogance and won. Where a minor knight and a forgotten nobleman rewrote history. Where a bridge became a weapon, and that weapon became Scotland's salvation. If you want to explore more incredible battles and the tactical brilliance that decided them, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments which battle you think deserves to be told next. History is full of heroes waiting to be remembered, and with your help, we'll make sure their stories live on.